I live in a city that my family helped build, in a quiet downtown apartment that feels a million miles away from the sprawling suburban house I grew up in. For the last 10 years, I've been a corporate lawyer, specializing in the kind of ironclad contracts that big businesses are built on. It's a skill I honed specifically to protect my family's construction empire, the very one that now refuses to even speak my name. This is the story of how they tried to cut me out of my own legacy, only to find out that I was the one holding the key to the entire kingdom. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Of course. Here is the updated story framework with the requested changes. Story category: Family Revenge. Main character: Morgan, 31, female, corporate lawyer. Supporting characters: Ethan, 34, CEO of the family business, antagonist/brother. David, 63, retired founder of the business, antagonist/father. Clara Evans, 48, senior project manager, ally. Susan, 61, homemaker, mother. Proposed chapter headlines. The setup: a family forged in steel and secrets. The betrayal: shut out in the cold. The discovery: a signature on a dotted line. The investigation: unearthing a hidden empire. The plan: the quiet architect of their downfall. The confrontation: the meeting they never saw coming. The aftermath: picking up the pieces. I will now proceed with writing the story. I'm Morgan, 31, female. I live in a city that my family helped build, in a quiet downtown apartment that feels a million miles away from the sprawling suburban house I grew up in. For the last 10 years, I've been a corporate lawyer, specializing in the kind of ironclad contracts that big businesses are built on. It's a skill I honed specifically to protect my family's construction empire, the very one that now refuses to even speak my name. This is the story of how they tried to cut me out of my own legacy, only to find out that I was the one holding the key to the entire kingdom. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Chapter 1: The Setup: A Family Forged in Steel and Secrets. Our family name, Sterling, wasn't just a name, it was a brand. Sterling & Sons Construction was etched onto the sides of cranes that dotted the city skyline, stamped into the concrete of sidewalks, and displayed proudly on plaques in the lobbies of skyscrapers. My father, David Sterling, built it from the ground up. He was a man of grit and vision, a master of turning blueprints into reality. He was hard, demanding, and believed that success was measured in square footage and profit margins. I grew up in the shadow of that success, alongside my older brother, Ethan. From the moment we were born, our paths were laid out for us. Ethan, the firstborn son, was destined to inherit the throne. He spent his summers on construction sites, learning the trade from the ground up, not because he loved it, but because it was expected. He had our father's ambition but lacked his patience and integrity. Ethan saw the company as a birthright, a machine that would print money for him, not a legacy to be nurtured. My role was different. I was the smart one, the one who was supposed to handle the things Ethan couldn't be bothered with: the paperwork, the legalities, the fine print. While he was learning how to pour concrete, I was learning about torts and liabilities. My father paid for my law school education with a clear expectation: I would become the company's in-house counsel, a legal shield to protect the empire he and Ethan would run. I never wanted to be a lawyer, not really. My dream was to be an architect, to design the buildings my family brought to life. But in the Sterling family, you didn't follow your dreams, you fulfilled your duty. So, I did my duty. After graduating at the top of my class, I came home and set up a small, independent law practice. My father insisted on this arrangement. He didn't want me on the Sterling & Sons payroll directly. "It keeps things clean," he'd said. "You work for us, but not for us. You're our contractor." It seemed odd, but I didn't question it. I trusted him. My firm's sole client was Sterling and Sons. I drafted every employment agreement, negotiated every supplier contract, and reviewed every municipal bid. I was the architect of their legal fortress. For a decade, this system worked. I was an integral part of the company's growth, yet I was always on the outside looking in. I attended board meetings as a consultant, not a family member. Ethan would present a new project, and I would be the one to ensure the contracts were flawless. My father would nod in approval, but his praise was always directed at Ethan's vision, never at the meticulous work I did to make it possible. I was a tool, a necessary and effective one, but a tool nonetheless. The dynamic was complicated. My mother, Susan, was the family's gentle, long-suffering mediator. She saw the inequality but was powerless to change it. "Be patient, Morgan," she'd whisper to me after a particularly dismissive comment from my father. "He just doesn't know how to show his appreciation." My only real ally within the company was Clara Evans. She was a senior project manager who had been with my father since the early days. Clara was sharp, no-nonsense, and saw everything. She respected my work and wasn't afraid to say so, often in meetings where my father and brother would overlook my contributions. Morgan's clause on subcontractor liability just saved us a six-figure lawsuit, she'd announce, forcing them to acknowledge me. Her validation was a small comfort in a world that consistently made me feel invisible. The tension that had simmered for years finally began to boil over when my father announced his retirement. He was handing the CEO title to Ethan. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. At the lavish retirement party, held in the ballroom of a hotel we had built, my father gave a grand speech. He talked about his legacy, about the son who would carry the Sterling name into the future. He thanked his employees, his partners, and even the city mayor. He never mentioned my name once. I stood there in a cocktail dress, a ghost at my own family's celebration. That night, Ethan found me on the balcony, overlooking the city we owned. He was flushed with champagne and arrogance. "Big night, sis," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll still keep you on as our legal eagle. Can't have the golden goose flying away." "I'm happy for you, Ethan," I said, the words tasting like ash. "You should be," he replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Dad and I have big plans. We're taking things to the next level. We're going to be bigger than ever." He stared out at the glittering skyline. "It's our time now." He said our, but I knew he meant his. The line had been drawn. I was a part of the machine, but I would never be a part of the family that owned it. I didn't know it then, but his words were more than just a drunken boast, they were a warning. The foundation of my world was about to crack, and I was about to find out that the family forged in steel was held together by secrets and lies. The transition was immediate and brutal. With my father officially retired, though still a looming presence on the board, Ethan remade the company in his own image. His leadership style was less about careful construction and more about aggressive expansion. He started pursuing high-risk, high-reward projects, stretching the company's resources thin. He replaced my father's seasoned department heads with his own people, younger, flashier executives who spoke in buzzwords and cared more about stock options than structural integrity. My role changed overnight. Ethan began to see my meticulous, risk-averse approach as a roadblock. I was no longer invited to strategic planning meetings. Decisions were made, and I was simply handed the aftermath to paper over. When I raised concerns about a new international deal, pointing out the unstable political climate and the potential for contractual loopholes to be exploited, Ethan waved me off. "Relax, Morgan," he said during a conference call, his tone condescending. "This is the big leagues. You can't be afraid to take a few risks. Just make the paperwork happen." The first major blow came 3 months after he took over. Sterling and Sons was bidding on the largest infrastructure project in the city's history, a new state-of-the-art transit hub. It was a legacy project, the kind my father had always dreamed of. I spent weeks preparing the bid, working tirelessly to ensure every legal detail was perfect, every contingency planned for. It was the most complex proposal I had ever assembled. A week before the bid was due, Ethan called me into his new, ostentatiously renovated office. The mahogany desk my father had used for 30 years was gone, replaced by a sleek slab of glass and chrome. "I need the final draft of the transit hub proposal," he said, not looking up from his tablet. "It's almost ready," I replied. "I just need to finalize the insurance riders. I'm concerned that our standard policy doesn't cover a project of this scale." He finally looked up, an annoyed expression on his face. "Morgan, just get it done. And once you do, I want you to hand over all your files related to the project. All of them." "What for?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "We're bringing on a new legal team," he said casually. "A bigger firm. Someone with more experience in this kind of global-scale project." The room went cold. "A new firm?" "Ethan, I've handled every contract for this company for 10 years. I know our legal structure inside and out." "And you've done a great job," he said, the words slick and insincere. "But we're in a new era. We need a team that reflects our new global ambitions. Don't take it personally." But it was personal. It was a direct attack on my competence, my contribution, my entire professional life. He was pushing me out. I looked at him, trying to see the brother I grew up with, the boy I used to build forts with in the backyard. All I saw was a stranger in an expensive suit, his eyes cold and calculating. The real betrayal, however, was yet to come. It arrived in the form of a registered letter from Sterling and Sons Construction, delivered to my office a month later. It was a formal termination of my firm's retainer contract. The letter was cold, clinical, and signed by Ethan. The reason cited was a strategic restructuring of third-party service providers. My sole client, the entire reason for my career's existence, had just fired me. I tried to call my father. His secretary told me he was unavailable. I tried to call my mother, but she sounded flustered and distant, clearly coached on what to say. "Ethan knows what's best for the business, dear," she murmured. "Your father trusts his judgment." I was officially an outcast. The family I had dedicated my life to had not only pushed me out of the business, they had cut me out of their lives. I was banned from the company headquarters, my access codes revoked. When I saw my parents at a charity gala a few weeks later, my father gave me a stiff nod, and my mother offered a watery, apologetic smile before Ethan steered them away. The message was clear: I was no longer one of them. The final, most humiliating twist came during a televised press conference announcing that Sterling and Sons had won the transit hub bid. There was Ethan, beaming at the podium, with the mayor by his side. Standing just behind him was a team of lawyers from a high-powered, notoriously ruthless firm. He thanked his team, his partners, and of course, his father. He spoke of a new vision, a new future for Sterling and Sons. He had used my work, my meticulously crafted proposal, to win the biggest prize in the company's history, and then erased me from the picture completely. I watched it on the television in my empty office, surrounded by boxes of files I no longer had a reason to keep. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. They hadn't just fired me, they had tried to annihilate my contribution, to pretend I never existed. The anger began as a slow burn, deep in my gut. They thought they could just throw me away like a broken tool. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had forgotten one crucial detail: I was the one who wrote the rules. And I knew exactly how to use them. For the first few weeks, I was adrift in a sea of shock and anger. My days, once packed with conference calls and contract negotiations, were now silent and empty. I'd built my entire professional identity around Sterling and Sons. Without it, I felt like a building stripped down to its studs. My father and brother's coldness was a constant, aching wound. They had not only taken my job, they had taken my family. One rain-slicked Tuesday, I decided it was time to dismantle my office. It was a painful process, each file folder a reminder of a project I'd poured my heart into. As I was packing up the oldest filing cabinets, the ones containing contracts from my first few years with the company, my hand brushed against a thick, leather-bound folder tucked away in the very back. It was labeled Sterling Holdings, LLC Incorporation and Operating Agreements. Curiosity piqued, I pulled it out. I vaguely remembered creating this entity years ago. It was one of the first things my father had asked me to do when I started my practice. At the time, he'd explained it as a simple holding company, a shell corporation designed to own the land and physical assets of the main construction business. It's for tax purposes, he'd said dismissively. Just a bit of smart structuring. You handle it, Morgan. Put it in your name for now to keep things simple. We'll sort it out later. My name? I had asked, surprised. Yes. You're the lawyer. You'll be the registered agent, the manager, whatever you call it. It's just paperwork. It keeps my name and Ethan's off of deeds and titles, adds a layer of protection. I was young then, eager to please and prove my worth. I did as he asked without a second thought. I set up Sterling Holdings LLC, listing myself as the sole managing member. I drafted the operating agreement, created the corporate structure, and then, as instructed, I began to process all of Sterling & Sons' major contracts through it. Every new land purchase, every long-term equipment lease, every major client agreement, they were all officially signed not with Sterling & Sons Construction, but with Sterling Holdings LLC. Sterling & Sons was merely the operating entity, the public face. The real power, the ownership of the assets, was vested in the holding company. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were the original incorporation documents, filed with the state 10 years ago. And there it was, in black and white, Managing Member, Morgan Sterling. My signature was on the dotted line. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I sank into my chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had completely forgotten the significance of this. In the day-to-day grind of managing dozens of contracts a month, the overarching structure had faded into the background. It was just the way things were done. My father and Ethan would negotiate a deal, and I would draw up the paperwork with Sterling Holdings as the contracting party. They signed the operational parts, but the master agreements, the documents that gave them the right to build on a piece of land or use a fleet of cranes, all flowed through the entity that I, and I alone, controlled. My father, in his arrogance, had made a critical error. He had created a legal firewall to protect his assets, but he had made me the gatekeeper and then forgotten to take back the key. He had assumed I would always be his loyal soldier, a permanent fixture he could command at will. He and Ethan had been so focused on seizing control of the public-facing company, Sterling & Sons, that they had completely overlooked the quiet, unassuming entity that held all the real cards. I started digging, my shock turning into a cold, sharp focus. I pulled up the digital records, cross-referencing every major contract Sterling & Sons was currently operating under. The Transit Hub Project. The new downtown luxury condo development. The multi-year municipal contract for road and bridge maintenance. All of them. Every single one was legally bound to Sterling Holdings, LLC. This meant that Sterling & Sons Construction didn't actually own the rights to these projects. They were, in legal terms, the primary subcontractor for my holding company. My company. A slow, icy smile spread across my face. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had locked themselves in a fortress and handed me the only key. They had built their entire empire on a foundation that I owned. And they had no idea. They had terminated my retainer, believing they were cutting me off. In reality, they had just severed their only official line of communication with the person who controlled their entire business. The anger and humiliation I had felt began to recede, replaced by something far more potent, resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming what was mine. They had tried to erase me, but my name was on the one document that mattered more than any other. They had taught me to be a lawyer, to respect the power of a contract. It was time to give them a lesson in their own curriculum. The initial discovery was a bombshell, but I knew that having legal control was only the first step. To truly understand the power I held, I needed a complete picture of everything Sterling Holdings LLC was tied to. My father and brother had become reckless in their ambition, and I suspected the company's dealings went far beyond what I had been privy to. It was time to conduct a thorough, forensic audit of my own company. My first call was to Clara Evans. I needed someone on the inside, someone I could trust implicitly. We met at a discreet coffee shop far from the city center. I laid out the corporate structure for her, showing her the incorporation documents for Sterling Holdings. Clara's eyes widened as she absorbed the information. A slow whistle escaped her lips. My God, Morgan. He put it all in your name and forgot about it? He didn't forget, I corrected her. He just never considered it important. I was family. He assumed I was a permanent asset, like a desk or a filing cabinet. When he and Ethan got rid of me, they only thought about firing the lawyer, not the owner. So what does this mean? She asked, leaning forward, her voice a low whisper. It means I need to know everything, I said. Every project, every partner, every loan. Especially the ones they tried to hide from me. Clara agreed without hesitation. She was disgusted by how I had been treated and had grown increasingly disillusioned with Ethan's leadership. He's running the company into the ground, she confided. Cutting corners on safety, squeezing suppliers until they're ready to snap. He's all flash and no substance. It's not the company your father built. Our investigation began. Clara became my covert source, feeding me internal documents, project status reports, financial statements, and internal memos. At night, I would cross-reference this information with the legal contracts held by Sterling Holdings. It was like piecing together a giant, complex puzzle. What I uncovered was worse than I could have imagined. Ethan, with my father's tacit approval, had been engaging in a pattern of predatory business practices. He was using the Sterling & Sons reputation to secure massive loans, then funneling that money into risky side ventures, speculative real estate deals and tech startups that had nothing to do with construction. These ventures were failing, and he was using the profits from the core construction business to cover the losses, creating a house of cards that was on the verge of collapse. The most damning discovery came from the Transit Hub project. The bid I had prepared was based on using high-quality materials and union labor, ensuring the project would be safe and built to last. The internal documents Clara smuggled to me showed that Ethan had amended the supplier agreements post-bid. He had swapped out the specified Grade A steel for a cheaper, inferior alternative from an overseas supplier with a questionable safety record. He had also signed a deal with a non-union subcontractor known for cutting corners. He was gutting the project from the inside out to maximize his profit margin, pocketing the difference to fund his disastrous side businesses. He was not only risking the company's reputation but also public safety. This was the leverage I needed. It was no longer just a breach of contract, it was fraud. He had won the bid based on a set of promises and was now flagrantly violating them. Armed with this knowledge, I expanded my legal preparations. I quietly engaged a forensic accountant to trace the flow of money from Sterling & Sons to Ethan's various shell corporations. I also hired a private investigator to discreetly gather evidence on the substandard materials being used at the Transit Hub construction site. The PI, a grizzled ex-cop named Frank, was thorough. He provided me with photographs of material delivery logs that didn't match the project specs and time-stamped images of safety violations on the work site. The picture became horrifyingly clear. My family's legacy was being dismantled by my brother's greed and my father's willful blindness. They had cast me out to protect a business that was already rotting from the inside. As I compiled my evidence, I made a crucial decision. My initial instinct was to simply pull the plug, to enforce the contracts, reclaim the assets, and watch their empire crumble. But that would hurt hundreds of innocent employees and scuttle projects the city depended on. My revenge couldn't be a wrecking ball, it had to be a surgeon's scalpel. I needed to remove the cancer, Ethan and my father, without killing the patient. I spent the next 2 months drafting a series of legal notices. For each major contract held by Sterling Holdings, I prepared a formal notice of breach, citing specific violations. For the transit hub, I detailed the material substitution and labor violations. For the equipment leases, I cited non-payment of fees to the holding company. They hadn't paid a dime since firing me, assuming it was an internal transfer they could ignore. For the land ownership, I drew up eviction notices. Each document was a legal masterpiece, airtight and irrefutable. I was building a cage of their own making, using the very contracts I had once designed to protect them. The investigation was complete. I had the evidence, the legal standing, and a clear plan. The quiet architect was ready to present her new design. With my arsenal of evidence and legal documents complete, it was time to set the stage. A direct assault would be messy and could drag on in court for years, allowing Ethan to hide assets and muddy the waters. I needed a single, decisive event that would leave them with no room to maneuver. The annual shareholders' meeting was in 3 weeks. It was the perfect venue. It would be a private meeting, attended by my father, Ethan, and a few key board members and minor investors who had been with the company for years. It was their sanctuary, the place where they reinforced their power. I was going to turn it into a courtroom. My plan had several phases, executed with the precision of a construction timetable. Phase 1, the summons. A week before the meeting, I had a process server deliver a package to the Sterling & Sons headquarters, addressed personally to Ethan, my father, and each member of the board. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a formal invitation to a special meeting of the managing member of Sterling Holdings LLC, to be held at my lawyer's office 1 hour before the official shareholders' meeting. The invitation included a single, ominous sentence: attendance is mandatory to discuss material breaches of all active operational agreements between Sterling Holdings LLC and Sterling & Sons Construction. I knew this would cause chaos. They knew I was their former lawyer, but they had likely forgotten the holding company's name or its significance. They would see it as a nuisance, an empty threat from a disgruntled family member. Ethan would be arrogant, my father dismissive. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to walk into my trap utterly unprepared. Phase 2, securing the assets. Simultaneously, I prepared to legally freeze their operational capacity. On the morning of the meeting, I would file a series of injunctions with the court, backed by my mountain of evidence. These injunctions, which would be granted on a temporary basis pending a hearing, would do 3 things. Freeze the primary bank accounts of Sterling & Sons, citing fraudulent use of funds that contractually belonged to Sterling Holdings. Place a temporary lien on all major construction equipment, which was leased from Sterling Holdings. Serve a stop work order on the Transit Hub project, citing the material contract breaches and public safety concerns, with copies sent directly to the mayor's office and the city's Department of Transportation. This would be the financial and operational checkmate. By the time they sat down for their shareholders' meeting, their company would, for all practical purposes, be paralyzed. They just wouldn't know it yet. Phase 3, the ally. I needed to ensure that once the dust settled, the company could survive. I met with Clara again and explained the final phase of the plan. I asked her if she would be willing to step in as interim COO if I was successful. She was the only one with the experience and integrity to right the ship. "Morgan, they'll fight you," she warned, though her eyes glinted with a fierce light. "Let them," I said. "They're about to find out the difference between owning a company and controlling it. I need to know you'll be there to manage the projects and the people when they're gone." She placed her hand on mine. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to clean up that old boys' club. Just tell me what to do." Phase 4, the presentation. For my meeting, I prepared a simple, devastating presentation. No emotional appeals, no family drama. Just cold, hard facts. I had copies of the Sterling Holdings operating agreement, the key contracts they were in breach of, the forensic accountant's report showing the flow of money to Ethan's failing side businesses, and Frank's damning photographs from the transit hub site. The plan was clinical. I would lay out their legal situation in unequivocal terms. They were not the owners of their assets, they were tenants. And they were being evicted. I would offer them a choice, a quiet, immediate resignation from their positions at Sterling & Sons and a full transfer of their shares to a trust managed by a neutral third party, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges for fraud and endangerment. If they refused, I would walk out of the room, and within the hour, the injunctions would be active, the city would be notified of the fraud, and the press would receive an anonymous tip about the safety scandal at the city's biggest public works project. Their reputation, their freedom, and their legacy would be destroyed before lunchtime. The night before the meeting, I sat in my quiet apartment, the city lights twinkling outside. For the first time in months, the ache of betrayal was gone, replaced by a steely calm. I wasn't the victim anymore. I wasn't the exiled daughter or the fired lawyer. I was the managing member of Sterling Holdings, LLC. And I was about to call a meeting to order. The conference room at my new lawyer's firm was deliberately chosen. It was neutral territory, sleek and impersonal, with a large oak table and a view of the very skyline my family had built. I sat at the head of the table, my presentation laid out in neat stacks before me. Ethan and my father arrived first, their faces a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. They saw my special meeting as a desperate, pathetic stunt. "Morgan, what is this?" My father, David, demanded, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "We have a real meeting to get to. If you have some grievance, this isn't the way." "Please, have a seat," I said, my voice even and calm. Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. He looked bored. The other 3 board members, old family friends and yes-men, filed in and sat down, looking confused. "Let's get this over with," Ethan said. "What do you want, Morgan? A bigger severance?" I ignored him. "Thank you all for coming. We are here today for a special meeting of Sterling Holdings, LLC. As the sole managing member of this entity, I have called this meeting to address a series of critical issues." I slid a copy of the Sterling Holdings Incorporation document across the table to my father. "Dad, you may remember this. You asked me to create it 10 years ago. You asked me to put it in my name to act as a legal shield for the family's assets." He glanced at it, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he still didn't grasp the implications. "It's a holding company. Just a piece of paper." "It's more than a piece of paper," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "It is the legal owner of nearly every significant asset utilized by Sterling & Sons Construction. The land under your headquarters. The leases for your entire fleet of heavy machinery. And, most importantly, the primary contracts for your largest projects, including the transit hub." I let that sink in. Ethan's smirk faltered. The board members began to look at each other nervously. "Under the terms of the operating agreements I drafted at your request," I continued, "Sterling & Sons is the designated operator, but Sterling Holdings retains ultimate ownership and control. And as managing member, that control rests with me." The color drained from my father's face. Ethan shot forward in his chair. "What are you talking about? That's insane. We're the owners." "Are you?" I asked, pushing a second stack of papers toward him. "These are the signature pages for the top 20 contracts that generate 90% of your revenue. Please note the signatory party. It is not Sterling & Sons. It is Sterling Holdings, LLC, executed by me." The room was silent. The truth was dawning on them, a slow, horrifying sunrise. "For the past 6 months, since you terminated my retainer, Sterling & Sons has been in material breach of every single one of these agreements," I stated, my voice like ice. You failed to remit licensing fees to the holding company, you violated subcontractor clauses, and you have made unauthorized alterations to project specifications. I turned my attention directly to Ethan. Which brings me to the transit hub. You replaced the specified structural steel with a cheaper, substandard product. You violated the terms of the city bid and, in doing so, committed fraud and endangered public safety. I placed a set of glossy 8 by 10 photos on the table. They showed the forged delivery logs and the unsafe conditions at the site. These will be in the mayor's hands in about an hour. Unless we can come to an agreement. Ethan stared at the photos, his arrogance finally shattering, replaced by pure panic. My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Here is the agreement, I said, sliding a final document to each of them. It was a single page. You will both resign from your positions at Sterling & Sons, effective immediately. You will place your shares into a blind trust, from which you will receive a modest dividend, but you will have no voting rights and no control. You will have no further involvement in the company, ever. You can't do this, my father whispered, his voice hoarse. This is my company. My name. You gave me the power to do this the day you told me to create a smart structure to protect your assets, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. You just never thought your assets would need protection from you. Ethan finally found his voice, a snarl of impotent rage. I'll fight you. I'll drag you through the courts for years. Go ahead, I said calmly. But while we're in court, your company will be dead. As of 9 a.m. this morning, I filed injunctions to freeze your bank accounts and halt all your major projects. The city is being notified of the transit hub fraud as we speak. By the time you walk out of this room, Sterling & Sons will be insolvent and under investigation. Or, you can sign these papers, and the company gets to live. Clara Evans will be appointed interim COO, and she will salvage what's left of your legacy. The choice is yours. The board members were pale, staring at my father and Ethan, silently pleading with them to end the madness. The empire was crumbling around them, and they were finally realizing I was the only one who could stop the collapse. My father, looking 20 years older than he had an hour ago, picked up the pen. His hand shook. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for the daughter he had cast aside. He found only a lawyer. He signed the paper. All eyes turned to Ethan. He was trapped, his face a mask of fury and defeat. He knew he had no move left to make. With a gesture of pure spite, he scribbled his name on the resignation, then threw the pen across the table. You'll regret this, he spat. No, I said, gathering the signed documents. You'll regret making this necessary. I stood up. This meeting is adjourned. I walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving them to the ruins of the kingdom they had tried to steal. I had won. But the victory felt heavy, the silence in the hallway echoing the hollowness in my chest. The fallout was immediate but contained, just as I had planned. The transition was announced internally as a sudden retirement and leadership restructuring. With Ethan and my father gone, a wave of relief washed over the company's long-suffering senior staff. Clara Evans stepped into the role of COO with a steady hand, her appointment met with widespread support. Her first act was to halt the transit hub project temporarily, announcing a full quality and materials audit to ensure compliance with the city contract. She was hailed as a responsible new leader, committed to integrity. My role remained behind the scenes. I was the silent owner, the power behind the throne. I used the authority of Sterling Holdings to restructure the company's finances, untangling the mess Ethan had created. I paid off the suppliers he had squeezed and renegotiated the loans he had taken out for his failed ventures. It was a Herculean task, but for the first time, I felt like I was building something instead of just protecting it. I was saving the company from my own family. My relationship with my parents was fractured, perhaps irreparably. My mother called me a few days after the confrontation, her voice torn between loyalty to her husband and a dawning understanding of what had happened. "Your father, he's a broken man, Morgan," she said, her voice choked with tears. "He and Ethan broke the company," I replied, my tone gentle but firm. "They broke my trust. All I did was hold them accountable." We didn't speak again for a long time. My father never contacted me directly. I heard through the corporate grapevine that he had retreated into a quiet, bitter retirement. Ethan left the city altogether, moving overseas to lick his wounds and, I assumed, look for his next shortcut to success. The Sterling name was still on the building, but the men who had defined it were gone. 6 months later, the company was stable. The transit hub project was back on track with the correct materials and a happy, unionized workforce. Clara was officially named CEO, and she was doing a phenomenal job. We worked together as partners, a formidable team of her operational expertise and my legal and financial oversight. One afternoon, Clara called me. "You should come down to the office," she said. "There's something you should see." When I arrived, she led me not to the executive suites, but to the design department. On a large drafting table, unrolled and held down by weights, was a set of architectural blueprints for a new community arts center. The board approved a new pro bono project, Clara explained. "To give back to the city. We need a lead architect." She smiled at me. "I believe you had some interest in the field once." I stared at the blueprints, at the clean lines and endless possibilities. For my entire life, I had been forced into a role I never chose, my dreams sacrificed for a family duty that turned out to be a one-way street. I had won the war, reclaimed my legacy, and secured the future of the company. But in all the fighting, I had forgotten what I had wanted to do in the first place: create. "I wouldn't even know where to begin," I whispered, tracing the outline of a rooftop garden with my finger. "I think you do," Clara said softly. "You're the best architect I know. You just spent the last year rebuilding this entire company from the ground up. You drew the plans, you laid the foundation, and you made sure it was built to last." A real smile, the first one in a long, long time, touched my lips. She was right. They had tried to ban me from the family business, only to discover I was its true owner. But my real victory wasn't in taking the company from them. It was in finally having the freedom to reshape it, and myself, into something new. Something better. Something I could finally be proud to call my own. I picked up a pencil. It was time to build.